Welcome to another edition of the Law and Gospel Devotional. My name is Erick Sorensen, and each week we gather with you to look at God's two words, both His Word of Law, which tells us everything we ought to do and points out the many ways in which we have not done it, and most importantly, His Word of Gospel, which ultimately points us to all that God has done for us and our salvation on account of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Well, it's good to be back here with you again, folks. This time we're getting the video made on Monday, so it'll be here for the remainder of the week. And we are not going to be looking at an epistle text, an Old Testament text, or even a psalm today, but no, we are going directly to the Gospels today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and pull up our presentation here so that we have a good sense of what we're going to be looking at. The Gospel text for this Sunday is a very familiar one. It is, of course, the depiction of what happens when the Lord of the storm endures a storm. Of course, we're talking about Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. The story goes like this. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" End of reading. Well, the natural response to the storms that come upon us in our life can be very often just like the response of the disciples. If you were paying attention, then you know that the first thing you heard as the disciples were dealing with this terrible windstorm that arose, is them accusing Jesus of not caring about them. It's pretty remarkable that their first instinct when things are going south pretty quickly is to cry out, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Does it not bother you that we're going to die on this boat?" And if I'm honest, it just reminds me of, how quickly my own faith in God can be shaken when I face the various storms that come upon us in life, whether literal or metaphorical. We all go through these moments. We all go through things that are overwhelming to us, that we cannot handle, that we see no way of escaping, no way of overcoming. And there's moments where we can get to the point where we start thinking, well, maybe this is a sign. Maybe this is evidence that God doesn't care about me when I'm suffering, when I'm going through difficulty, when I'm going through challenges. Maybe that's a sign that God is even not there for me at all, that He might abandon me. And I got to say, on the one hand, just from a purely human perspective, the disciples' response here is at least understandable. I'm not saying it's good or justified, but it's understandable because it's just so human. After all, Jesus is sleeping throughout the whole thing, and probably at this point, they're desperately trying to get rid of the water that's filling up the boat. We're told that's what was happening, that the boat was getting filled up with water. And so it just so often is the case that if God doesn't immediately fix our storms, well, we can errantly assume it must be because He doesn't care. But of course, there could be nothing further from the truth. And so what we're left to ponder is whether this is actually an expression of carelessness on Jesus' part, that He's sleeping in the midst of the storm, or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's something like poise. Because after all, you do have to remember that as fully human, Jesus was susceptible to the storm's effects too, and yet He sleeps comfortably because He knows who's really in charge. It could be, in fact, it is the case, that His apparent carelessness is actually poise meant to strengthen the faith of His disciples. This is what good leaders do. This is what the best leader of all time does. Somehow or another, when the storms come, it is those who are able to see a pathway beyond it. It is those who are able to stay calm in the midst of the storm that people inherently flock to. They inherently trust them to lead the way, even if they barely know the person. For example, I'm sure many of you remember the pilot, Captain Sully Sullenberger, who landed his plane that seemed to be crashing in the Hudson in New York and miraculously did it in such a remarkable fashion that no one ended up injured, even though they technically crash landed in the Hudson. He so skillfully maneuvered the plane that they kind of just coasted onto the Hudson, and then they were able to evacuate all the people. It was an amazing thing. But one of the things that's so remarkable about Sully Sullenberger wasn't just that he landed the plane, but that he kept his head on behalf of the people the whole time. In an interview about this event, he said, "It wasn't until about 90 seconds before we hit the water that I spoke to the passengers. I wanted to be very direct. I didn't want to sound agitated or alarmed. I wanted to sound professional. This is the captain. Brace for impact." Yes, it's true. Jesus is the one who is Lord of the storm, and so he does not freak out. He does not get agitated, but he displays nothing but pure competence, as we'll come to see as we move on throughout this story, which of course shows us just how much power Jesus does have over the storm. As he is awoken by his disciples, it says, "And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm." You see, instantly by the word of his power, he brings the raging sea to a quiet silence, to a calm, just by speaking the word. Yes, there's a reason he could sleep in the stern, because he knows what power he has as God over all. Now, this is a very important event in the life of Jesus, because it really did show, it was an example of him showing his divinity to his disciples again. Tim Keller notes that one consensus point among the ancient cultures was that the sea was uncontrollable by any power but God. In ancient cultures and legends, the sea was a symbol of unstoppable destruction. The ocean in full fury was an ungovernable, inexorable power, and only God could control it. He continues, Jesus did not call on a higher authority. If you read any of the old miracle healing legends, the healers call on a higher power. They say, "In the name of so-and-so, I say." By his actions here, Jesus is demonstrating, I am not just someone who has power. I am power itself. Anyone and anything in the whole universe that has any power has it on loan from me. End quote. This is just something really, really important to note, and something that I love about the book of Revelation. At the end of all things, one of the things that we're told that will be the case in the new heavens and new earth is that the sea will become like glass. And again, this is alluding to all ancient cultures' view of the sea being completely and utterly untamable, filled with all sorts of scary things. It was seen as the evidence of a fallen world. And yet, at the end of all things, just like Jesus gives us a preview here, it's completely calm, like glass. And so, yes, the disciples and us and we have very good reason for trusting Jesus in the midst of our storms. We can trust him because, far from being careless, he's just poised. He knows what he's doing, and he indeed has the power to overcome the storm, even if he allows us to endure the storm much longer than we ever would have wanted to ourselves or ever thought we were capable of handling. He knows he's capable of handling it, and therefore we can endure. Yes, Tim Keller was right when he points out this important point about the power of Jesus. This echoes one of my favorite old hymns, "Be Still My Soul." One of the last stanzas, it says, "Be still, my soul, when dearest friends depart, and all is darkened in the vale of tears. Then shalt thou better know his love, his heart, who comes to soothe thy sorrow and thy fears. Be still, my soul, the waves and winds still know his voice who ruled them while he dwelt below." This reminds me of what Paul says of Jesus in Colossians chapter 1. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. How many of the things hold together? All the things hold together on account of Jesus Christ. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And yes, that's exactly what the disciples are forced to recognize again. And so you would think, based on this incredible event, that the disciples would be flooded with peace at the display of Jesus' power. But what happens instead? Quote, they were filled with great fear, literally mega afraid. That's the way you could translate those Greek words, mega afraid, and said to one another, who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? You see, the disciples are terrified and fearful, as they often are when Jesus does an inexplicable miracle, because they're once again reminded that they are sinners in the presence of a holy God. And that is terrifying. If we had any inkling of just how holy God is, I know we confess it, but most of us haven't had the experience of Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6. Most of us haven't had the experience of Moses. Most of us haven't had the experience of these disciples, because the reality is every time God shows up like this in Scripture, the response of people isn't one necessarily instantly of comfort, but it's of terror, because we recognize we are not worthy, unless, of course, we are declared to be worthy on account of another. And that brings us to the last reason we can trust Jesus in the midst of our storms, and that is because he is so abundantly patient and steadfast in his loving kindness toward us. Because even though he rebukes his disciples, one of the things that sticks out to me is he never abandons them. He never forsakes them. No matter how many times their lack of faith shows up, no matter how many times they end up blowing it, no matter how many times they deny him, as in the case with Peter, or how many times they make stupid statements that are totally contrary to what his will is, nevertheless, he doesn't give up on those who are his. And so, yes, he rebukes them. He says, why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? And this is a harsh rebuke, but it's important to note he sticks right there with them. Now, it would have been understandable if he had decided to leave them, because after all, his disciples saw him exorcise demons and raise people from the dead, feed thousands with a few loaves and fishes, and I could go on and on and on. It would be understandable if he got frustrated and said, I've had it with you guys. How many times do I have to do this kind of thing? But no, that's not our God. That's not Jesus Christ. Instead, he disciplines us because he loves us, as Hebrews 12 tells us. And so behind this harsh rebuke to his disciples is a desire to grow their faith, is a desire to get them to trust him more in the midst of the future storms that will no doubt come their way. And so it's like the father of the demon-possessed boy who, when asking Jesus to heal his boy, Jesus said, do you believe I can do it? And the man said, I believe, help my unbelief. And you know what Jesus' response to that was? He didn't say, well, that's not enough faith for me. I didn't hear a rock-solid confession of faith. I'm out. No. Instead, he healed the boy. And so our confession can always be the same. I believe, help my unbelief, without fear that God will be offended or bothered, that God will be upset with us. He knows that we are frail. He knows that we are fickle. He knows that our faith waffles. He knows that it's often the size of a mustard seed or less. And yet, because he is patient and gracious, he does not respond to our weak faith by tossing us to the side, but continues the work he has begun in us. And the reason he can do that is because eventually he will become the one tossed over the side in the midst of the storm for us, because he willfully absorbs the storm of God's wrath on our behalf. Yes, this is the reason he came, and the reason that we can be confident no matter what storms we go through, that he will faithfully stand by us and get us through to the other side. Again, as Tim Keller has said, Jesus was thrown into the only storm that can actually sink us, the storm of eternal justice, of what we owe for our wrongdoing. And yet he did it because he loves us. He's patient with us. He's poised through it all with us. And he will bring us to what he's started in us. He'll bring it to completion, folks, and that is the good news. All right, folks, that is our long gospel devotional today. A little shorter one today, but it's only 6 verses, but I think lots of comfort in there. I hope you've been blessed by it, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks.